Are you ready to learn the truth about what really went on behind the majestic walls of medieval castles in winter? We are used to seeing huge fireplaces and warm furs in movies, but the reality was much harsher and more unforgiving for the inhabitants of these stone fortresses. These structures were built to defend against enemy armies, but their architects paid no attention to protecting them from another, invisible and deadly enemy: the cold. Stone, designed to stop arrows and battering rams, turned into a giant frost accumulator in winter, sucking the heat out of everything alive inside. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary bed became a separate fortress inside a room, and why tapestries on the walls were more expensive than gold, not for their beauty, but for survival. What if everything you've been taught about the romance of castle life is outdated? The main problem with any medieval castle was the material from which it was built. Massive stone blocks had high thermal inertia, which provided welcome coolness in summer, but turned into a disaster in winter. Walls several meters thick would freeze through during the autumn months and begin to act as powerful refrigeration units. Even if the air inside could be heated, the cold stone would instantly absorb the heat, leaving the inhabitants with no chance of warming up. Inside, there was constant dampness, which made the cold even more unbearable and bone-chilling. Condensation accumulated on the icy surfaces of the walls, turning into frost or dripping in thin streams of water onto the floor. This created the atmosphere of a damp basement, where people were forced to spend most of their lives. It was almost impossible to get rid of this dampness, as ventilation was provided through narrow loopholes that let in the icy wind. Window openings in early castles did not have glass, as this was an unaffordable and rare luxury. Instead, wooden shutters were used, which had to be kept closed, plunging the rooms into complete darkness. If the shutters were opened for light, streams of frosty air and snow rushed inside. Sometimes the windows were covered with oiled cloth or ox bladders, but this provided only minimal protection from the wind and almost no light. The floors in castles were often paved with stone slabs, which remained icy around the clock, regardless of the weather outside. Walking on such a floor without thick shoes with wooden soles was a sure way to get seriously ill. The cold from the ground penetrated unhindered through the foundation and spread throughout all floors of the building. Even on the upper levels, the situation was no better due to the constant drafts blowing through the corridors. The corridors and passageways between the halls were often not heated at all and served as aerodynamic tubes for drafts. Moving from one room to another became a real challenge, requiring serious mental preparation. People tried to minimize their movements around the castle, preferring to stay in one relatively warm area. This led to overcrowding and forced isolation in a confined space. The castle's architecture included spiral staircases, which also acted as exhaust shafts, intensifying the movement of cold air. Warm air, if it appeared at all, instantly escaped upward into the cracks in the roof and towers. It was physically impossible to heat such huge spaces with high-vaulted ceilings. All the heat was concentrated only in the immediate vicinity of the fire source. The feeling of cold was exacerbated by the lack of airtight doors and interior partitions. Wind blew under each door, causing the candle flames to constantly flicker and tremble. Heavy oak doors, swollen from dampness or dried out from age, rarely closed tightly. The gaps were plugged with rags and straw, but this was only a temporary and ineffective measure. In such conditions, the castle became not a home, but a testing ground for the endurance of the human body. The owners of the castles, despite their wealth and status, suffered from the cold just as much as their servants. The only difference was in the amount of clothing and the quality of food, but the physics of cold affected everyone equally. Winter became a time of survival, when status was determined not by gold, but by access to warmth. Engineers of the time understood the problem, but construction technology did not allow for effective insulation. Stone was the only material available that could withstand a siege, and comfort was sacrificed for safety. It was a conscious choice that had to be paid for with health every winter. A castle was a fortress for war, not a sanatorium for life. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think? Could you live for a week in such conditions without modern heating? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about real history.
The hearth provides...
Are you ready for the shocking truth about the place that was considered the heart of the castle? The Great Hall, with its huge hearth, is traditionally perceived as a center of warmth and comfort where all the inhabitants gathered. However, in practice, this giant fireplace was an extremely inefficient heating device for such a large room. Most of the heat generated by burning huge logs literally flew out of the chimney along with the smoke. The design of open fireplaces at that time had a low efficiency coefficient. To feel the heat, you had to be in close proximity to the fire, literally a meter away from it. A person standing by the fireplace faced an unpleasant phenomenon. Their face and hands were scorched by the heat while their back continued to freeze. This created constant thermal discomfort, forcing people to constantly turn around. Smoke was a constant companion in the Great Hall, despite the presence of chimneys. When the wind was strong or the draft was wrong, acrid smoke returned to the room, stinging the eyes and making it difficult to breathe. The ceilings and upper parts of the walls were always covered with a thick layer of black soot. The inhabitants of the castle were inevitably saturated with the smell of burning, which ate into their clothes and hair. The size of the Great Hall worked against its inhabitants, as the high ceilings collected all the heat at the top. Below where the people were, the air remained cold and damp, creating a sharp contrast in temperature. Even if the fireplace was lit around the clock, it was impossible to warm the stone walls of such a large space. The walls continued to radiate cold, creating convection currents that felt like an icy wind. In an attempt to retain heat, the hall was often divided into zones using portable wooden screens. These screens created small, cozy corners, protected from direct drafts from doors and windows. Inside these zones, the temperature could be a couple of degrees higher than in the rest of the hall. This is where the noble inhabitants tried to stay, leaving the periphery for servants and guards. The floor of the Great Hall was covered with a thick layer of reeds or straw mixed with fragrant herbs. This served as primitive insulation, separating people's feet from the icy stone. The straw helped to retain some heat, but it also quickly became damp and required regular replacement. Walking on such a covering was warmer, but it also became a source of dust and dirt. The central hearth, which was used in older castles without wall-mounted fireplaces, was even less effective. The smoke rose to an opening in the roof, but often filled the entire hall with thick fog. In such conditions, eyes watered constantly, and coughing became a familiar sound on winter evenings. This was the price to pay for the opportunity to warm oneself by an open fire in a large group.
Secured. Aye, my lord. We doubled the watch an
The Great Hall required enormous amounts of firewood for heating, which created a logistical problem. Servants had to constantly bring in huge logs, opening the doors and letting in cold air. Keeping the fire going was a continuous, arduous task that never stopped, day or night. Wood supplies for the winter were gathered for months and stored in huge warehouses. The seating arrangement around the fire was strictly regulated by the social hierarchy of the castle's inhabitants. The lord and his family sat closest to the heat, followed by important guests and close knights. Servants and soldiers had to make do with the heat that reached the far corners or kept warm by working. Social stratification in the castle in winter was physically felt through body temperature. Do you think it was fair to distribute heat according to status, or should survival be equal for all? However, even the lord could not feel comfortable when he went to bed. In the next chapter, you will learn why the bed was the most complex engineering structure in the bedroom. The secret that people pay thousands for today when buying antiques was then a matter of life and death. The Lord's bedroom was perhaps the only place where a relatively comfortable microclimate could be created, but this required special efforts. A bed in a medieval castle was not just a piece of furniture for sleeping, but a real room within a room. It was a massive wooden structure designed to insulate the sleeper from the icy air around them. The main element of this system was a thick canopy made of heavy wool or velvet fabric. The curtains were closed on all four sides, creating a small enclosed space. Inside this fabric cube, the heat from human bodies was retained much better than in an open room. The temperature inside the closed canopy could be 5 to 10 degrees higher than outside. The upper part of the bed was also covered with a thick fabric roof to prevent heat from escaping upwards. This design protected not only from the cold, but also from drafts, as well as from dust and debris falling from the ceiling beams. This created a feeling of psychological security and comfort in the huge and gloomy castle. Climbing into such a bed, a person literally shut themselves off from the hostile outside world. The mattresses were stuffed with feathers and down, which are excellent natural insulators. The feather bed was soft and warm, enveloping the body and preventing heat from escaping from below. The poor slept on straw, which was much less warm and quickly became flattened. The presence of a down feather bed was one of the main signs of wealth and a guarantee of survival in harsh winters. Bedding was made of linen, but numerous woolen blankets and fur covers were thrown over it. There could be a huge number of layers, and it was difficult to turn over under their weight, but they kept the heat in reliably. Wolf, bear, or sheep skins were often used, with the fur facing inwards for better insulation. The weight of the bedding itself created a feeling of warmth and security. Before going to bed, the bed was always warmed up with special devices so that one would not have to lie down in an icy bed. Servants used metal hot water bottles with long handles, filled with hot coals from the fireplace. They were passed between the sheets, drying them from dampness and warming the fabric. Sometimes bricks or stones heated in the fire and wrapped in thick fabric were used. In those days, people often slept in special nightcaps and shirts to minimize heat loss through the head. The head was the only part of the body that could peek out from under the blanket into the cold air. Long night shirts made of wool or thick linen also helped to retain body heat. No one risked sleeping completely naked on the coldest nights of winter. Sleeping together was often practiced, as the human body is a powerful source of heat. Spouses slept together, huddled close to each other, which was a necessity, not just a display of affection. Sometimes beloved servants or even warm-blooded creatures would sleep at the foot of the bed to add another source of heat. The more living creatures there were in the confined space of the bed, the higher the temperature. In the morning, the most difficult test was to get out of this warm cocoon into the freezing room. The temperature difference was shocking, and this moment required tremendous willpower. Servants tried to light the fireplace in the bedroom long before their masters woke up, but the air still remained cold. Thus, the bed was the most technologically advanced and expensive item in the household of a medieval feudal lord. It provided the few hours of recovery that the body needed to fight the cold. Like this, if you wouldn't give up such a cozy fortress in winter either. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about the secrets of history. Guess how long it took a castle dweller to get dressed in the morning? Clothing in the Middle Ages served as a portable home, creating an insulating layer of air around the body. The main material for winter clothing was wool, which has the unique property of retaining heat even when wet. Woolen fabric was dense, felted, similar to modern felt or cloth, which made it windproof. A linen shirt always served as the bottom layer, as wool was too rough for direct contact with the skin. Linen absorbed sweat and created a hygienic barrier that could be washed frequently. Several layers of woolen tunics or dresses of varying thickness were worn over the linen. The principle of layering, which is used by modern tourists and the military, was invented at that time. Outerwear was often lined with fur, which was the most effective way to retain body heat. The nobility used expensive ermine, marten, or fox fur, which was light and warm. Commoners used sheepskin, goatskin, or wolf skins, which were heavier but just as warm. Fur lining turned an ordinary cloak into a real fur coat that could withstand the cold.
A fair price, 15, and not a coin more.
Particular attention was paid to protecting the extremities, which were the first to freeze. Woolen stockings were worn on the legs, the prototype of modern stockings or tights, which fit snugly around the leg. Often, several pairs of stockings were worn at the same time, and the feet were additionally wrapped in pieces of fabric. Shoes were made of leather, and straw or felt insoles were often placed inside to insulate them from the cold floor. The head and neck always had to be covered, even indoors. Hoods with long tails that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf were incredibly popular. Chaperons, headdresses that covered the shoulders and chest, provided reliable protection from drafts. Taking off your headwear in a cold castle meant voluntarily giving up precious warmth. The sleeves of clothing were often made very long to cover the hands completely. Sometimes the sleeves were removable, allowing them to be changed depending on the temperature or type of activity. Hands were hidden in the wide sleeves of the opposite arm or in fur muffs. Gloves were rarely worn indoors as they interfered with fine motor skills, but they were mandatory outdoors. The clothing was heavy, and by the end of the day, its weight caused noticeable physical fatigue. Carrying several kilograms of woolen fur was a necessary price to pay for the opportunity to stay warm. Movements in such clothing became more fluid and measured, which also helped to conserve energy. Running or making sudden movements in full winter attire was difficult. Belts and straps played an important role, pressing the layers of clothing tightly against the body and preventing warm air from escaping. The tighter the clothing fit, the less chance there was for drafts to reach the skin. However, clothing that was too tight could disrupt blood circulation, which only increased the feeling of cold. The art of dressing was all about finding the right balance between a snug fit and freedom of movement. At night, people often did not take off all their clothes, leaving the bottom layers on for warmth. Undressing completely in an icy room was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous to health. Changing underwear became a quick and unpleasant procedure, which people tried to do as close to the fire as possible. Clothing was the main barrier between the fragile human body and the merciless cold of the stone walls. Without the right wardrobe, it would have been impossible to survive in a castle, even with fireplaces. How many kilograms of clothing do you think a medieval knight wore in winter and everyday life? But clothing only retains heat. Food must generate it. In the next chapter, you will learn what people ate to keep from freezing. The winter diet in a medieval castle was radically different from the summer diet and was aimed at obtaining the maximum amount of energy. People intuitively understood that the body needed many more calories to fight the cold. The basis of the diet was meat, mainly fatty and filling, which provided a long-lasting feeling of satiety. There was little fresh meat in winter, as livestock was slaughtered in late autumn, so as not to have to feed it throughout the winter. Therefore, salted, smoked, and dried meat, prepared on an industrial scale, prevailed on the tables. Ham, sausages, and salted meat were the main sources of protein and fat for the inhabitants of the castle. This meat was tough and very salty, so it was soaked and boiled for a long time. Rich meat broths and soups were the perfect dish to warm the body from the inside. Fish was also on the menu, especially during the numerous religious fasts. It was also preserved for future use, salted, dried, or smoked, turning it into pieces as hard as wood. Dried cod or salted herring were common foods that were soaked and cooked with various sauces. Fatty fish was preferred because it provided more energy to warm the body. In winter, vegetables were only available in the form of root crops, which could be stored for a long time in cellars. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions formed the basis of side dishes and were added to thick stews. Cabbage was fermented, which allowed it to retain at least some vitamins for many months. The lack of fresh greens and fruits led to vitamin deficiency, which weakened the immune system. Bread was the staple food, and its consumption increased in winter, as it was the most affordable source of carbohydrates. Huge loaves were baked from coarse flour, which could be stored for weeks without going completely stale. Bread was often used instead of plates. Thick slices were topped with meat and gravy. The bread, soaked in fatty sauce, was eaten at the end of the meal, providing an extra portion of calories. Hot drinks played a vital role in maintaining body temperature throughout the day. Herbal teas, hot wine with spices, and honey were drunk constantly to keep warm. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were valued not only for their taste, but also for their warming properties. They were believed to stimulate blood circulation and help the body withstand the cold. Sugar was a rare and expensive luxury, so honey was the main sweetener and source of quick energy. Honey was added to drinks and porridge and used to make sauces for meat. It was a concentrated source of energy that helped to quickly restore strength. Honey supplies in the castle were carefully guarded and used sparingly. Meals were long and abundant, especially dinner, when the whole family gathered around the fire. Food was one of the few pleasures available during the gloomy winter months. Feasts not only helped to satisfy hunger, but also to combat seasonal depression and boredom. A communal meal with hot food was an important social ritual that brought people together in the face of the harsh winter. The quality of food directly depended on status. Servants ate simple porridge and scraps, while the masters enjoyed delicacies. But the principle was the same. Food had to be hot, fatty, and plentiful. Hunger in winter was synonymous with death, as an emaciated body could not resist hypothermia. The winter diet was hard on the stomach, but necessary for survival in the icy castle. It was fuel that burned in the furnace of metabolism, sustaining life. What lies behind the beautiful cinematic image of feasts is frightening when one imagines the actual level of light in those days. In winter, daylight hours were critically short, and the huge stone castle was plunged into thick darkness for most of the day. The sun barely had time to rise above the horizon before it began to set, leaving the inhabitants in darkness. The stone walls, several meters thick, with narrow loophole windows, let in very little light, even at noon on a clear day. There was often no glass in the modern sense. It was replaced by mica or oiled cloth, which stole even more light. Life inside the castle took place in eternal gray twilight, which weighed heavily on people's psyche. The inhabitants felt like prisoners in a stone bag, cut off from the outside world. This created an oppressive atmosphere of hopelessness and melancholy. Artificial lighting in the Middle Ages was dim, unreasonably expensive, and often extremely unpleasant to use. The main and most affordable source of light for most people was tallow candles. They were made from melted animal fat, most often sheep or cow fat. The technology used to make them was primitive, and the result left much to be desired. These candles burned very unevenly, constantly crackling and giving off very little light. At the same time, they smoked heavily, covering everything around them with greasy soot. But worst of all, when burning, they emitted a disgusting, nauseating smell of burnt fat. Being in a closed room with such candles was a real test for the sense of smell. Wax candles, which smelled pleasantly of honey and burned brightly and evenly, were an incredible luxury. They were only available to the wealthiest lords, kings, and for church needs. The use of wax candles in everyday life was considered a sign of great wealth and extravagance. An ordinary knight could only afford such a luxury on major holidays. Bright torches, which are so often shown in historical films, were rarely used inside living quarters. This was due to the large amount of acrid soot they produced and the high risk of fire. Sparks from a torch could easily set fire to straw on the floor or dry tapestries on the walls. Therefore, open fires of this type were strictly prohibited in bedrooms. They were used exclusively to light the courtyard or large stone corridors, where there was good ventilation. Small clay oil lamps or bowls of fat were used in living quarters. A floating wick made of fabric or plant fibers was dipped into the fat. The light they gave off was dim, unreliable, and constantly flickered at the slightest draft. Such lighting created long, frightening, dancing shadows on the walls and ceiling. Any piece of furniture in such light could seem like a sinister monster. The lack of light severely limited any human activity in the evening. Reading, sewing, embroidering, or doing delicate crafts was only possible at the window. Work was only in full swing during the short hours when the sun was high in the sky. As soon as the sun set, active life in the castle virtually came to a standstill. People switched to a passive mode of waiting for sleep or engaged in quiet conversations by the hearth. Wasting expensive candles on idle talk was considered the height of extravagance for the master. People tried to go to bed as early as possible so as not to sit idly in the frightening darkness. Winter nights seemed endless, stretching on for 14 or even 16 hours. It was a time of boredom and forced idleness that simply had to be endured. Sleep was the only way to pass the time until dawn. Constant exposure to dim light had a detrimental effect on eyesight, which deteriorated quite quickly for many. Eyes became incredibly tired from constantly trying to make out small details in the flickering light of a candle. Nearsightedness was an occupational hazard for scribes and seamstresses of that time. By old age, many castle dwellers were practically blind. The eternal twilight also contributed to the development of severe depression and general lethargy. The inhabitants of the castle lived in a state of constant light deprivation and serotonin deficiency. Without sunlight, people became irritable, pale, and apathetic. Winter blues were a common condition for the medieval nobility. Acrid smoke from tallow candles, torches, and open hearths accumulated under the ceilings of the rooms. This created a heavy, stifling atmosphere that had to be breathed day and night. Ventilation was provided only through natural cracks and drafts. It drew out precious heat, but did not always manage to clean the air of soot. People were forced to breathe a harmful mixture of soot and the smell of rancid fat throughout the long winter. The walls and ceilings quickly turned black, and clothes became saturated with the smell of smoke, which was impossible to air out. This led to chronic respiratory diseases and constant coughing among all the inhabitants. The lungs of the castle dwellers suffered no less than those of miners. Polished metal mirrors were used at that time not so much for beauty as for engineering purposes. They served as reflectors to amplify and direct the dim light of candles. They were deliberately placed behind the source of fire to reflect the beam in the right direction. This allowed for a slight increase in the illuminated area on the table or near the chair. Every time someone left the room to relieve themselves, they had to prepare a reliable source of fire that would not be extinguished by the wind. Darkness turned one's own home into a confusing labyrinth full of hidden dangers. Corners and niches were hidden in the darkness, and the imagination painted horrors there. One felt helpless as soon as the candle went out. The fear of darkness was a very real, justified, and logical feeling for a medieval person. Darkness was strongly associated with danger, evil spirits, witches, and the unknown. Night was a time when evil forces ran rampant, and there was no escape. Fire was the only protector, a sacred symbol of life and safety in this stone tomb. But the impenetrable darkness and bone-chilling cold were far from the only enemies of the inhabitants. The lack of basic amenities and sanitation made winter simply unbearable torture. Are you ready to learn the whole truth about personal hygiene at minus 20 degrees? Washing in winter in a medieval castle was a rare, difficult, and even dangerous procedure. Immersion in a hot bath was considered a luxury available only to the highest nobility and required enormous effort from the servants. Dozens of buckets of water had to be heated in the kitchen and then carried through cold corridors to the living quarters. The water cooled down while it was being carried, so the process required the coordinated work of an entire team. A wooden tub was lined with sheets to protect the skin from splinters and placed as close to the fireplace as possible. Often, a fabric tent was stretched over the bath to keep the rising steam and heat inside. It was the only place in the room where a person could undress without freezing instantly. But as soon as the bather left the hot water, cold air rushed over their wet body. Due to the difficulty of organizing a full bath, most people in winter limited themselves to partial washing. They used a basin of warm water, a jug, and a piece of cloth to wipe their face, hands, and other parts of the body. This allowed them to maintain a minimum level of cleanliness without risking hypothermia. People tried not to wash their hair at all in winter, or did so very rarely, as drying long hair by the fireplace was a long and difficult process. Wet hair in a cold room was a direct route to a cold, which in those days could be fatal. Women used dry methods of cleaning their hair, such as combing it with powder or bran. Men also preferred not to wet their heads unnecessarily, hiding their unwashed hair under headgear. The smell of unwashed bodies was masked with perfumes and fragrant herbs, which were carried in small bags on clothing. Washing clothes in winter was a real nightmare for laundresses. They had to heat water in huge boilers and often rinse the laundry in an icy river or well water. The laundresses' hands were constantly cold. Their skin cracked and bled from contact with ice-cold water and alkaline soap. Drying laundry took days as it froze outside and dried slowly indoors, increasing the already high humidity. The toilets, or cloakrooms, were small niches in the wall, protruding outside the castle. They were even colder than the other rooms as the opening led directly to the street. Going to the toilet in winter was a challenge that people tried to do as quickly as possible. The draft blowing from below, from the opening, was literally icy. For nighttime needs, chamber pots were placed under the bed so that one did not have to go out into the cold corridor or toilet. In the morning, the servants took out the contents, but the smell inevitably remained in the room. This was considered a lesser evil compared to having to leave a warm bed and go to an icy niche. Comfort and warmth were prioritized over ideal hygiene. The lack of regular washing led to skin problems, but the cold was considered a more serious threat. Doctors of the time even warned against frequent washing in winter, believing that water opened the pores to disease. The layer of dirt and grease on the skin was perceived by some as additional protection from the cold. Teeth were cleaned with cloth, sometimes with the addition of salt or ash, but the water for rinsing had to be warm. Ice-cold water caused toothache and could damage the enamel. Personal care required planning and always involved the use of fire. Hygiene in a winter castle was a compromise between the desire to be clean and the fear of getting sick. It was a battle in which cold often defeated cleanliness. Bare stone walls were the main heat absorbers, so people tried to cover them in any way possible. Tapestries and wallpaper were not just interior decorations and displays of wealth, but an essential element of thermal insulation. Thick woolen fabric created an air gap between the icy stone and the air in the room. The thicker and denser the tapestry, the better it retained heat inside the room. Carpets were hung on the walls in several layers, covering doorways and window niches. This helped to combat drafts and reduced heat loss through gaps. In bedrooms and small rooms, tapestries could be hung on all walls from floor to ceiling. This created the effect of a felt yurt installed inside a stone box. Wooden wall paneling was also used for insulation, especially in later periods. Wood is much warmer to the touch than stone and has better insulating properties. Rooms clad in wood warmed up faster and cooled down slower than bare stone halls. This was an expensive luxury, available only for the lord's private quarters. Floors, as already mentioned, were a source of cold, so they were covered with a thick layer of reeds or straw. In wealthy homes, woolen carpets brought from the east or produced locally were laid on top of the straw. Carpets on the floor were rare and cost a fortune, so they were cherished. Animal skins were often used, scattered around the bed and fireplace, so as not to step on the cold floor. The reeds on the floor were not changed often, and dirt and food scraps accumulated in the lower layers. But in winter, this cultural layer served as additional insulation from the ice slabs. Fragrant herbs, such as lavender or mint, were scattered over the reeds to mask odors. This created the illusion of freshness in a closed, unventilated room. The ceilings in living rooms were sometimes made lower with fabric or wooden beams to reduce the heated volume. In castles with high arches, heat rose and cooled there. Suspended fabric ceilings helped keep warm air down below, closer to people. It was a simple but effective engineering solution. The windows were covered with heavy wool or velvet curtains, which were drawn back during the day and closed tightly at night. The curtains served the same purpose as shutters, creating another barrier against the cold. Windowsills were often lined with pillows or fabric bolsters to plug any gaps. The struggle for air tightness was endless. In the corridors and stairwells, where there were no tapestries, the cold was particularly acute. The transition from a room upholstered in fabric to a bare stone corridor was a real temperature shock. The castle was a patchwork quilt of warm and cold areas. The art of survival lay in the ability to create as many layers as possible between oneself and the stone. Fabric, wood, straw, everything was used to insulate living warmth from dead cold. In winter, the castle turned into a huge textile warehouse. Even the furniture was arranged to protect against drafts and create cozy nooks. The high backs of chairs and benches served as screens, reflecting the heat from the fireplace and shielding the back from the cold. In addition to stationary fireplaces, the castle's inhabitants used various portable heating devices. Brazier, metal baskets on legs filled with hot coals, could be placed anywhere in the room. They were placed next to the table during meals, next to an armchair while reading, or in a corner where the heat from the fireplace did not reach. Brazier provided intense heat, but they also burned oxygen and could be a source of carbon monoxide. Special hollow metal balls were used for the hands, inside which red-hot coals or hot stones were placed. These hand warmers were carried in pockets, muffs, or simply held in the palms. They allowed you to warm your fingers, which froze first and maintained the mobility of your hands. Priests used such balls during long services in icy cathedrals. Hot stones and bricks heated in the hearth were wrapped in cloth and used as local heaters. They were placed under the feet while sitting at the table or taken to bed. Bricks retained heat for a long time, releasing it gradually over several hours. This was the simplest and most affordable way to obtain a personal source of heat. There were also portable foot warmers, small wooden boxes with holes inside which a pot of coals was placed. By putting your feet on such a box and covering yourself with a blanket, you could create a warm microclimate for the lower part of your body. Women often use such devices while doing needlework. Fur capes and blankets were a common feature of everyday life. They were carried from room to room. When sitting on a bench, a person would always put a pillow under them and cover their feet with a skin. Immobility was the enemy, so if you had to sit, you had to keep yourself as warm as possible. Animals in the castle also served as sources of heat. Small dogs were often held in the arms or on the lap. Ladies carried them with them not only as pets, but also as living hot water bottles. The warmth of an animal's body was a pleasant and safe way to keep warm. The kitchen was the warmest place in the castle, and many servants preferred to sleep there, close to the huge stoves. The residual heat from cooking lasted longest there. The nobility also sometimes visited the kitchen under a plausible pretext, simply to stand in the warmth. All these tricks show how desperately people sought any way to raise the temperature around them. Comfort came from small things: a hot brick underfoot, a warm ball in their hands, and a woolen blanket on their shoulders. Heat was not a given, but a resource that had to be obtained and preserved. The lack of central heating forced people to be inventive and use mobile solutions. Everyone in the castle was their own stoker, taking care of their own heat balance. These methods, however primitive they may seem, made it possible to survive the harshest frosts. But physical survival was only half the battle. It was equally important to stay sane. Winter in a medieval castle was perceived not simply as a change of season, but as a long, exhausting siege where nature itself was a merciless enemy. Deep snowdrifts and icy winds turned the fortress into a lonely island, completely cutting off its inhabitants from the outside world for many months. People found themselves locked in a stone bag, forced to see the same faces day after day in a confined space. The feeling of isolation weighed heavily on the psyche, creating an atmosphere where time seemed to stand still. This inevitably led to increased internal tension, outbursts of irritation, and complex webs of intrigue that arose from idleness. Boredom was a terrible and insidious enemy, fought with all available means to avoid going mad from monotony. Chess, dice, backgammon, and cards turned from simple entertainment into a vital ritual that helped kill the long hours of winter evenings. Bets in these games were often made not for profit, but for the thrill, which could dispel the gray melancholy, at least for a short time. Musicians, jugglers, and storytellers were valued at their weight in gold at this time, becoming the main guardians of the mental health of the castle's inhabitants. The ability to captivate listeners with an exciting story or sing a new ballad guaranteed a person the warmest place by the hearth and the best piece of meat. Religious holidays, especially Christmas, became bright beacons of joy in the endless succession of twilight days. Preparations for them took weeks and filled the lives of the castle's inhabitants with purpose and meaning, distracting them from gloomy thoughts. Decorating the main hall with evergreen branches, preparing rare and spicy dishes, rehearsing amateur performances, all this united people in a common cause. The festive feasts were a powerful psychological release, allowing pent-up emotions to be poured out in laughter, song, and dance. It was a moment of triumph of life over the dead silence of winter outside the walls. The anticipation of spring became an obsession, a collective dream that was whispered about and prayed for in the chapel. Any change in the weather, whether it was an icicle beginning to melt or a shift in the wind, was discussed as a sign from above. For the prisoners of the castle, spring meant not only physical warmth, but also the return of freedom, the opportunity to open the gates and breathe fresh air. It was a promise that the world outside the walls still existed and was waiting for their return. The confined space and constant darkness sharpened all the senses to the limit. The smells of unwashed bodies and smoke seemed sharper, and the sounds of footsteps louder. Any triviality, a sidelong glance, or an awkward word could spark a serious quarrel or even enmity. That is why etiquette and strict rules of courtesy were not a whim, but a harsh necessity for maintaining a fragile peace. The ability to get along with others, smooth things over, and tolerate the shortcomings of neighbors was as important a survival skill as the ability to wield a sword. During these months, the social divide between servants and masters became slightly less pronounced, as they all found themselves in the same boat. The common cold penetrated both velvet and coarse wool, forcing people of all classes to seek out the same source of warmth. This forced rapprochement sometimes gave rise to strange alliances and unexpected friendships that would have been impossible at other times of the year. Winter, with its merciless honesty, erased unnecessary conventions, leaving only people thirsting for warmth and companionship. But it was during these long months of forced inactivity that the most grandiose plans for future military campaigns and political alliances were born. The silence of the castle libraries and chambers provided time for deep reflection, writing chronicles, and developing strategies. While nature slept, the human mind worked, preparing for action with the first rays of the spring sun. The castle, immersed in winter sleep on the outside, lived an intense intellectual life on the inside. Surviving winter in a medieval castle meant triumphing not only over cold and hunger, but also over one's own demons. It was a severe test of fortitude and endurance, which unfortunately not everyone passed. Those who did survive to see spring emerge from the castle gates changed, hardened by long months of icy captivity. Be sure to share your bold ideas and topics for our future videos in the comments. It is very important for us to know what interests you most and what piques your curiosity in history. Perhaps you have long wanted to learn the shocking details of field medicine in those harsh times? Or are you more attracted to the hidden recipes and unusual secrets of medieval cuisine that textbooks don't mention? We carefully read all your reviews and listened to every opinion of our viewers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel right now to stay up to date. This is the only reliable way to not miss our new exciting episodes and historical investigations. There are still many undiscovered secrets and amazing facts from the distant past ahead of us. Click on the bell to be the first to embark on these exciting journeys with us. Stay with us, because real history is much more interesting than any fiction.